Ladies and gentlemen, welcome back to the podcast. I have a guest that's been here before, in online, first time in person, and such a soft, wise, gentle soul, but with so much drive and so much passion. I know your story from last time, and we'll do a summary version of that today. I've got the beautiful Nikki Cassa in my room, in the space today, in the podcast studio today. Just for people that haven't watched the first one, go back and watch it. It was about a year ago, and it was really, really powerful to hear your story, what you've been through, and how you've been able to work through that. Obviously, we're always still healing. But Nikki Cassa, mind-body practitioner, speaker, podcast host, upcoming author. I'd love to hear about that a little bit more on this one. On a mission to transform women's lives and elevate the consciousness of humanity through our events and education. Nikki Cassa, thank you for joining me today. How are you?
Thank you for having me. Thank you.
How's the Gold Coast? You just moved up here.
Gold Coast is wonderful. I absolutely love it here.
Awesome.
Sydney was great. I moved here from Sydney back in October, and it was a good place for me to first move 4 years ago when I first dived into fitness and the industry as a personal trainer. Lots of opportunity, really fast business people and hustle and bustle. And back then I was so, what's the word? I definitely was very much in my masculine with the hustle culture and mentality, and at all costs. At one stage I was working 3 jobs. I was doing personal training, I was doing sales for Hattie Boydell, world champion.
Wow.
Then I was doing bodybuilding posing on the weekend.
Yeah.
So, if I was working 77, 80-hour weeks, you know that you're there to work hard and hustle. And I loved it. But then, after a few years and certainly going more into mindset and personal development, I recognized how much I was living in survival. And once I did a lot of healing, I wanted to be a bit more grounded and slow down. And Gold Coast was an opportunity to do that. I've visited here a few times, and there was something about this place. I was like, oh, it just feels warm and nice, and the people are amazing. So, moved up.
A lot of consciousness on the Gold Coast. I think it's actually quite, I know this is just my perspective here. I've been here for, how long have I been here for? About 12, 13 years. I find it's quite the balance, because there's actually quite the sort of egocentric side of the Gold Coast where it's partying, drinking, drugs and all that stuff. Yeah. But then there's like the Call to Be Conscious movement. There's all these self-development people. There's all these NLP coaches. So it's actually quite a duality on the Gold Coast. Yeah. That's my perspective anyways. Give us a quick summary of your story. I know we went deep into your story. I would like to go sort of deeper into your work today, but give us just a short summary version of your story.
Yeah, so I am a mind-body practitioner. I am an online women's coach. So I work predominantly with women in the online space. And I've been doing this for 3 years now, coming up on 3 years. And when I first moved here when I first moved to Sydney, I, as I mentioned before, was a personal trainer. And I absolutely loved it. Being a PT was my first opportunity to get out of what I was doing before and potentially just like not being a bit lost and not really knowing what I was doing with my life. So fitness industry really woke me up to helping people, to finding my purpose and my passion. And along the way, I realized through my own healing journey, like, wow, there is so much that is untapped with our potential, our human potential, when we are looking at a really one-dimensional way of even just fitness, right? And when I started to do my own healing and my own growth, I was like, wow, I don't want to change people's, I don't want people to be fit and mentally they're so lost and depressed. I want people to be strong mentally, emotionally, and understand and know themselves spiritually. So I started to see this multi-dimensional way of growing and healing, and through my own study and exploring the answers of how do we become, happy human beings, I really recognized how do we be happy? Yeah. And it's a question that a lot of people don't ask themselves. Like, are you really happy? Right? Are you really happy?
When did you start? What was the catalyst for that like line of thinking, right? Like what makes me happy? where does this, I know you do a lot of inner child work, which I'm very passionate about. I know you do you use the word healing, that aligns so much with me, but I guess what was the catalyst to sort of send you down this very long rabbit hole that I think we all eventually do it in our own way, but obviously you're a student of it and you're a teacher of it. So what started the journey?
Yeah. So it starts with asking some of the most hardest questions and the right questions. Right? So I think a lot of us ask the wrong questions, and they say things like, well, why am I not happy? Right? Why is my life like this? Why am I so stuck? Why am I so unhappy? Why does my partner hate me? Why does my boss such an asshole? And we ask the wrong questions. And why questions tend to be quite rhetorical too. When you say, why am I the worst? Why am I like this? Why do I feel so depressed with my life? Well, there's a lot of judgment that comes from that. And often people don't ask that question with the intent to go, let me actually slow down, be still, look within, and really look for the answer to that question. It becomes like a punishment and a self-fulfilling prophecy to just point out all the reasons of why their life is shit and why they're a victim of that. But then they never do any change for that. So when we start asking the right questions, then we can start to open up the answers that we're really looking for to solve our problems. And so one of the really important questions that a lot of people don't ask themselves until they get to whether it's rock bottom, a midlife crisis, or something really existential happens in their life. And the questions are, who am I? What's my purpose? What's the meaning of my life? What's the meaning of life in general? Am I happy?
How did you start pursuing those questions?
Lewis, I actually asked those questions from a really young age. I remember going through school and asking myself, why am I here? And it put me through a really depressive state.
Wow. How
because
old are you, sorry?
I would have been maybe 16 or 17.
Yep.
And because I didn't have any mentors, I didn't have any role models that I looked up to, my family growing up, mental health was never a discussion that we spoke about in the family, so it wasn't normalized. Yeah. I remember at that age, and I have so much compassion for young Nikki at 16, but she was so naive to mental health. I thought that it was a brain tumor. Like mental health was like there was something wrong with your brain, and I didn't know that what was actually happening. And yes, from a neurological response as things that's happening in the brain, but a lot of it is looking at the mind. And so I didn't have any understanding of that. And so I thought there was something wrong with me. And when you have all of this depression come up as a child, you tend to look for external ways to hide that and to bury it, right? So lots of drinking, lots of partying. And I teach my clients that often when there's internal pain and we act to bury it, we will look for external forms of pleasure to subside that. So really superficial external things to bury that and mask it. So from a young age, I remember these questions plaguing me and not knowing what to do with it. And then when I went into personal development, I went, oh my God, like these are the answers that I've been looking for years, and I've just never known how to ask them properly, and I've never had the answers to fulfill those questions.
You articulate things so well, and I'm having like flashbacks as you're talking. I'm like, same, like mental health. I get emotional talking about it. Like it was so painful at my upbringing with mum, with dad. Like I've got vivid memories of it. So I think that's where I think your passion comes from, and mine does too, right? So I'd like to know, what was your introduction? Like you said, you got into self-development. What was that like? Because something that I find, I'm speaking from my experience, is like for people that are looking for it, some people just don't know where to start. It's like self-development. It's a cult. It's seminars. It's like this weird shit. Like, what is it? It's like, that's not what it is. So, and I was literally just writing out a bit of my journey in a thing I'm working on. And I was like, shit, what was I like? I was so skeptical. I was so fearful. I was so just so judgy of everything. But then like for me, it was Tony Robbins that got me introduced to it. I'm like, when I listened to it, like you said, it was just like, where the fuck has this been? I'm like, what the hell? This is so powerful for me, for my pain, my struggles. So I guess my question was, What was your starting point? Where did you get into it? Or did someone recommend you a book or a podcast or a YouTube video? Probably didn't have podcasts back then, but seminars. What got you into it?
So there were two really pivotal moments in which I decided to dive inwards and really look at who I am and start to explore these really the depths of my soul and the truth of the world that we live in. So the first moment was after I hit rock bottom, right? So I mentioned, there's certain moments in people's lives where they ask these questions, rock bottom, midlife crisis, things like that. So for me, it was rock bottom after being traumatically abandoned while on holiday.
It was Bali, right?
It was Bali.
That was from our last conversation.
Yeah, my drink was spiked. If you want to listen to the full story, you can go back to my other podcast episode we did with you. But essentially, I thought I was going to die on that holiday. And I remember waking up in a hospital ward for psychiatric patients. And my legs were covered in blood. I was in clothes that I didn't recognize. Yeah, the nurses barely spoke English. And my friends the night before pretty much said, she's crazy. If she keeps talking like this, lock her up. And they did. And I woke up, my friends were gone. And after a few days, I'm not sure whether it was 2 or 3 days because it was so blurry, my dad had to come and get me. And I had no idea if he was coming or what was happening. So that was a really scary time for me, but it was I needed that to shake me. To shake me out of the way that I was living and how I was showing up and treating myself, my body, my temple, my soul. And when I got back from Bali and I started to do all the healing, and of course, I completely removed myself from that friendship. I haven't seen any of them since. But then something really incredible happened. I looked in the mirror and I didn't recognize myself. And I was like, who the fuck are you? Who are you, Nikki? Well, better yet, who do you want to be? Because I knew...
How old are you at this point?
21. Yeah. I knew I didn't want to keep being the way I was and acting, and I looked at my friendship circle and realized, well, if that's who I was hanging out with, what does that say about me? What are my values? What are my beliefs? What kind of self-worth do I have? I looked at my job and I went, wow, is that the job you want to be doing in 20, 30, 40 years' time?
Good questions.
And I looked at where I was living and I just went, wow, you have two options here. You can either stay the same and, the one saying I hate is it is what it is. Because it's well, no, it doesn't have to be, right? It is what it is. So you can choose that path, it happened, it is what it is, or you can change it. So I was all right, I'm going to do the hard work, the healing, and I decided to move to Sydney at that time.
Where were you before that, sorry?
In Adelaide. Adelaide's where I was born and grew up.
Yeah.
And dove into the fitness industry. And then it was actually, this brings me to the second pivotal thing. It was actually Hattie who at that time I was doing some sales reps calling for, right? Sales calls. And in the 4 months I worked for her, Lewis, I didn't make one fucking sale.
Oh, wow.
And
how did that feel personally?
That was traumatizing, that experience, because every week we'd show up for training, sales training. It was Nikki, have you done any sales this week? And I was I would shake. I would sweat and shake profusely before I got on these training calls because I was so much of my self-worth was tied to what I was doing.
That was a question I was going to ask.
Yeah. So much of my self-worth was tied to what I was doing. And what happened after Bali, I actually really needed that anchor, right? Because after Bali, I really lost a sense of who the fuck am I? How am I going to recreate myself? And what I looked to was externalized success. Yeah. Of course you do. When you're 21 years old and you don't know anything about emotional intelligence, you look to what you think is a definition of success and happiness and you go, oh, I'll just do that. Yeah. So my goals were to become world champion back then. So, who better to learn from than Hattie Boydell herself? And so after about 4 months of that, the sales mentor, he said, Nikki, you got a bullshit sandwich. There's something coming up with your dad here, and it's a bullshit wound you got to heal.
Who said that to you?
Oh, one of the sales trainers.
There you go.
And I went, oh, okay.
Wow. Yeah. I was like, fuck, that's a pretty
Took that
deep
knife
one.
to the heart.
Yeah.
But I knew that there has to be something there, because there must be a reason why I'm not making sales.
Yeah.
I'm implementing absolutely everything, and
Yeah.
I was fucking tenacious to succeed. I've
Yeah.
always had
That's good.
a drive to succeed, and a lot of that has come from Dad, right? So I've taken this best quality about me, and it's now supposed to be the worst thing about me. And I thought, okay, all right, I'll do this healing thing. And so they paid for me to go and do the Landmark Forum.
Oh, no way. Okay. Here we go. I guess unbiased. What's your opinion on that? I've heard mixed reviews about Landmark.
Yeah, so Landmark Forum taught me a lot.
Yeah.
It also taught me how to not create a safe space for people.
It seems very pushy. I don't know. That's just my
it
experience.
is very pressure. There's a lot of pressure that comes to some of the exercises. Yeah. So you don't have a choice of whether you want to call that person that traumatized you or not. You are almost expected to, or it's an indication you're going back into your old ways of being. What I then eventually realized when I started to learn neuroscience is a 3-day seminar doesn't heal trauma that's stored in our neurological pathways, in our body and in our brains, right? That's stored in the brain stem. Mindset only equates for 20%, right? So top-down processing. So mindset is top-down, so we start with our mind. Only equates for 20% of change when it comes to integration, right? And then when we look at neuroscience from our processing with our body, right? So trauma that's stored in the body, that equates for 80%. It's stored in our nervous system. And so, that experience was, for some people, can be extremely re-traumatizing. And after the first one, I had a lot of breakthroughs, completely woke me up. It was the second one that was quite traumatizing for me. And I think I spent a good week being completely dissociated from my body.
Wow.
Because I was reliving.
Can you explain that a little bit for the people listening?
So what happened for me in the second seminar was I relived the trauma from Bali. Yeah. And I called the people from Bali to tell them essentially what I was pretending since Bali, which essentially was I couldn't trust people, I couldn't let people get close. And although that was true, right, that was the way I coped from how I was hurt so bad by these people and abandoned, I would keep people at an arm's length. But by calling these people, essentially I was like reliving that trauma in my body. Now, what happens when we feel trauma is the body goes, okay, I'm either going to fight or flight. Can't do that because I literally have to call these people, right? So I can't fight them, can't run away. Well, what are my other survival pathways? And then we have freeze and collapse, and then we have attach. And so for me in that moment, I went fully into collapse. I completely collapsed and wanted to withdraw and dissociate from my body because I essentially relived that again and again. And people do this all the time. If you look at people who get stuck in the weekend, binge drinking, who gamble, it might be food. Food's also an example. They use that as a means to unconsciously disassociate, which means detach from their body, right? From their mind, from their pain, from their trauma. Yeah. And so for me, it was just a really severe thing. So I had a lot of breakthroughs, yes, but I also learned about why it's really important to create a safe space so that people can still have the same breakthroughs. And sometimes, we do need a breakdown before we have a breakthrough, but not putting people back into a state of survival and then being like, bye, we'll see you at level 2. So that's really important.
Powerful stuff. You have got so much substance to you. I think I've asked 2 of the 10 questions I've got, and we're going to be here for a while, but all value. My question, I would like to go down the women empowerment, fear, just women stepping into their own, because I've got a beautiful, strong woman and in my relationship who's very passionate about the same topic. And I guess coming from, to be transparent, an upbringing where there was that sort of toxic masculine figure as my dad, and I kind of unconsciously picked up a lot of those habits. So it's been really, really healing for me to go through this journey with my partner. I'd love to know for you, who works with women day in, day out on this topic,
Mm.
what is, I guess, if you were to sort of categorize I don't know if you use these terms, but the wounded feminine or the wounded woman, and I don't know what you've got, the conscious, that's the name of your program,
Yep,
right?
the conscious woman.
Beautiful. Could you maybe define the two, and what's the journey you take them on? Let's go down that. Let's go
Beautiful.
through it. Beautiful.
Great question. I love this question because it really opens up such an important discussion and distinction between what you first mentioned with the wounded masculine.
Yeah.
And I think we're creating a lot of awareness around women's empowerment. And also now there's a big conversation that's starting to open up with men and mental health.
Yeah.
And when, I know you had Ryan on, my partner on the podcast, and he talked a lot about the wounded masculine and essentially a lot of men that are actually wounded boys.
Yeah.
And we're starting to link the two between, well, generally the wounds that we have with men comes from their fathers.
Yeah.
But then what we really need to understand what impact that's having on the daughters, what impact that's having on the sisters, right? And so, if you look at wounded women, generally there's a wound with the father. There's a father wound. And so, and again, if we look at mum, then mum tends to have a wound with her father wound. And so it just gets passed down the ancestral lineage.
Yeah.
And so...
This is amazing. I'm just picturing all the women in my life. I'm like, yep, right, yep. Wow.
Yeah. And it's a really important discussion for women to start to have with themselves, because we all come out of the womb perfect. Yeah. Whole, perfect and complete, right? You don't look at a baby and go, oh, they're going to be...
Put it back in. I don't want this one.
There's something wrong with them. You look at this baby and it's the most precious, beautiful miracle. And then along the way, Lewis, we learn and we are taught that there are things about us that are flawed. There are things that happen to us as well that then we think, I need to protect myself from people and from the world. And unfortunately, where it starts is in the home. And because of, our parents and our parents' parents that didn't have access to emotional intelligence and mentors and podcasts, and we live in such a fantastic society now where we have that at the tips of our fingers, but because our parents and their parents didn't have access to this knowledge and information and emotional attunement, well, what happens is then we were traumatized growing up unconsciously from parents that loved us to the best of their ability. So let me give you an example of how this shows up in a really simple sense that a lot of people don't categorize as trauma, which is why it creates the wound, because we push it away and we look for maladaptive ways to cope for it, which essentially means unconscious ways to cope with it. Yeah. So let's say, what's the most simple? Let's say you're working really hard on a project, or there's something that you're like a running race or sport or art or anything that you tried really hard so that you could get dad's attention and approval, right? So you work hard on this thing, dad comes home and, he's providing really hard for the family. So he's been so stressed out and he goes, not now, not now. And he walks away. In that moment, there's a part of you that's deeply seeking to have these needs met. And she goes, or he goes, oh, why did daddy walk away? Does daddy not love me? What's wrong with me? Am I not important? Am I not good enough? And this is where, instead of our parents recognizing, hey, my child is asking for my attention here. And yeah, I've had a stressful day, but how do I need to regulate my emotions right now so that I'm not projecting that onto my daughter or my son? And of course, our parents didn't have this emotional intelligence back then. And so if that happens repetitively, what will happen is generally, and there's a huge society of people walking around like that still today, and I'm one of them, which is then we perform in order to get their attention. So our attention and love is not based off who we are. We then either lash out and become rebels and get really naughty. Yeah. And if that doesn't work, then maybe we become overachievers, right? Or hyper independent, because I know dad's not going to love me. Yeah. So I'm going to have to love myself and I can't rely on anyone. Yeah. And so it starts from a really young age. And what happens is for women, because of that, what we do is we shut off our feminine, because the feminine is surrendering, the feminine is open, the feminine is in flow and in sync. Whereas the masculine is the strong, it's the hard, it's the action, it's the plan, diligent. And so for a lot of women, we then jump into our masculine to keep ourselves safe. And it works, right? It works. It worked for me when I was working 3 jobs, 80 hours a week. I remember calling Dad once and telling him how much money I made. And he goes, "That's good, dear, but everyone has to work hard for a living." And it fucking crushed my soul. It crushed me. And so obviously done a lot of work on that since then. But I realized what was happening, that I was relying on my masculine. Now, for women, having masculine energy is important. In my business, I'm very masculine because I need to be to operate at a high level, have systems, have procedures, hire people. I can't be too far in my feminine. Otherwise, I'm like, la, la, la. Like, I won't accomplish any goals. So it's important to be balanced. It's important to have both. But for a lot of women, we oscillate too far into our masculine. So really, really critical of ourselves. We look for needs for control, like excess needs for control. We're very demanding. Again, we have unrelenting standards. So we're overachievers, not high achievers. We're overachievers. And if we don't meet that standard, we set the bar higher. Or what can happen if that doesn't feel safe, and we might have some really deep wounds with the masculine, we oscillate, which means we swing into the other end of the spectrum where we go overly feminine. So we're pushovers, we're people pleasers, we're super needy, we don't have any empowerment. A lot of women in this place become victims of domestic violence. They become victims of sexual assault and abuse. And that was certainly my experience growing up too. So you can start to see the epidemic of what we're experiencing here, with a lot of people not in tune with their femme mask and not balancing the polarity of both of them from an integrated and embodied place within.
I've got a question. I don't actually know how to articulate this because I've never asked it before. There's no perfect answer to this question, I would assume, but what's the balance between the not being the, let's say, the over feminine, where you're the people pleaser, the pushover, you get taken advantage of, etc., and also being a strong, empowered woman without going too much to the other side? So I'm just kind of like, how do you find the balance? Where is it more so maybe your partner that you're with, because you got to be with the right partner, because maybe the wrong part, I don't know, I don't really know how to articulate that question. Where's the right balance of it? Because I don't know if I've met, obviously you're someone that comes to mind that I follow on social media that has to have a really awesome balance. I've got a mother who I love her dearly. I love you, mum, but she's the pushover. She's been taken advantage of, puts everyone else's needs ahead of hers. She's a yes woman and doesn't stand up for herself. And then I've had other women in my life who are the over masculine side, and I haven't really been exposed to too much of, I guess, the right balance. So what is that balance, and how does one achieve it, is probably my question.
Great question. So in order for people to balance their polarity between their femme mask, the light and the dark, they really have to first seek to understand themselves. We live in a society where we look to our external world to tell us who we are. And the only way where we can really get a sense of who we are is slowing down and looking inwards. And that's kind of scary for a lot of people.
Most people avoid that.
Yeah. And if you're listening and you're like, what do you mean look inwards? Like, the answers you seek are within. Like, it doesn't have to be super spiritual like that. We can look at it from, for example, I incorporate a lot of like science into what I do for analytical minds like that, who like to have like a model or something to understand it, as opposed to a more spiritual side of things where it's just like, the answers you seek are within. It's good to have both. But, if you're listening and this is something that's quite new to you, what we're looking at, for example, is like, from the simplest form, is like our beliefs about ourselves. So, for example, if I believe that I need to be hyper independent, or I believe that I need to be strong because in some past experience or event or something that happened to me, that became like a wound or something that was painful, then that would reinforce my state of being, right? So for me, I certainly had that with when it came to relationships with men, when it came to friendships as well. And it didn't serve me, because then when it came to men, I would attract relationships where I would always be like, how did I get here? Like, how did I attract another man who lacks so much emotional intelligence with himself? He's so far in his masculine. He doesn't have any feminine, no sense of emotional attunement within themselves. And then same with friendships. I was like, why do I keep attracting friends where like they're just not serving me? They're just not on my level. And I had to look inwards. I had to look at myself.
Yeah.
And that can be really hard and confronting for a lot of people, because we like to point and go, well, it's my partner. Yeah. It's just, these people. It's just my narcissistic boss. And you got to look at, well, who created that? Who attracted that relationship? You chose that job. And for the ego, excuse me, for the ego, which likes to protect us, right, part of our subconscious mind, it doesn't like to admit that we're flawed or that there's parts of us that we need to work on. It's much easier to protect ourselves, right? And it's not I would say it's more of a protective thing than it is I just don't want to take any responsibility. For some people it can be, but it's generally a place of protection, is that it feels much safer to say, well, it's my partner that needs to change, than for you to look inwards and go, maybe I got some stuff I got to work on in order for this relationship to thrive, or for me to attract the right people into my life, or for me to get over the victimhood, or be successful, or make a change in my life. And that's the hard work. So hard work is looking inwards and going, what are all my patterns? What are all my beliefs that I have about myself, the world, what I'm capable of and not capable of? Are they serving me? And if not, there's only one person that can change them and take responsibility and radical ownership of that, which is ourselves.
There is so much gold in here. I'm writing more questions as we go. So I've got a 2-part question. One to the single ladies and maybe gentlemen as well listening to this, but also ladies in a relationship. If they're resonating with a lot of the stuff that you're talking about, which I'm sure they are, and they're either one of each, they're either too feminine, they're a pushover, they're attracting the narcissistic partner, they're not stepping into themselves, they're not doing the inner work, or they're the other side. They've got their walls up, they're super masculine because it's how they've protected themselves, and they're not allowing themselves to step into their feminine. What are things that they can start doing? Like right now, oh my God, this sounds amazing, Nikki. You're talking to my soul right now. What can I do? What can they start doing?
Yeah, awesome. Love it. Grab your notepads. So one thing that I've found consistently working with clients is that they have more awareness of the things that they don't want in their lives, and the things that they're moving away from, and little to no awareness of what they really want in their lives. So if you look at it from an embodiment perspective of who they are, for example, I just don't want to be this way. I just don't want to have this body, or I just feel like I'm sick of sabotaging, or I just don't want to be unhealthy. And you get people to look at, well, what would it look like for you to not have that? It's like, I just, just don't want to keep questioning and doubting myself. It's like, yeah, but then what would you have? Yeah. And they go,
so true.
I don't know. And there's a problem, right? There's a problem there. It's like, if you don't know where you're going, how are you going to get there? Yeah. Right? It's like getting in a car and being like, I'll just drive to Melbourne, with no sat nav. How are you going to get there? I don't know. Yeah. I just know I don't want to be here. Yeah. It's like, so where do you want to go? Just not here. Yeah. Right? Imagine getting in an Uber and saying that. You'd be like, where the fuck do you want to go? Just not here.
Not here.
So I think a lot of people lack clarity and awareness with what they truly want, Lewis.
Yeah.
And so
100%.
You can start to get clear on, number one, who you want to be. That's the most important thing.
Great
because
question.
The common denominator in every single area in your life is you, right? Your relationships, your job, your platonic friendships, everything comes back to you. You attract it, you create it. And if that's a hard pill to swallow, that's great, because it means that you are in the driver's seat to change that. So you've got to get clear on, well, who is that? Well, that woman. Is she the woman that is powerful or powerless? Is she conscious or unconscious?
These are great questions, guys, by the way. Just rewind the last 30 seconds. Keep going.
One thing that's really great for relationships is, so I like to talk to my clients, and this is good if you're single or you're already in a relationship, which is So we have this phase, these 3 phases. First phase is the honeymoon phase.
Yep.
Don't love that name, but
Yeah.
we'll just use it.
Yep.
The second phase is the trigger phase. Now, a lot
Trigger
of people
phase,
know what they want in the honeymoon phase. You know, I want a sexy man, good looking, he's funny, he's charismatic,
Yep.
he trains, he's successful, he makes
Yep.
good money, he's secure, right? Super standard,
Yeah.
pretty normal,
Yep.
right? And then I go, okay, cool. And so when you get to the stage where all your wounds start coming up and you get
This
really
is my jam. I
comfortable,
love this stuff.
and you know, you start to find out the things, you know, the dark parts of them. Once you've finished the interview stage,
Yeah, nice. I like that.
well, you only show them the best parts of yourself,
Yeah.
and now you're dating.
Yeah.
What do you want then?
Yeah.
You know, so for example, I say to my clients, so when you and your partner have a disagreement, what do you really need from your partner then? And they go, what do you mean? And I go, what do you mean? What do I mean?
Yeah.
What do you want? And they go, well, what do you mean? I can't figure that out until I find it. It's like, no. That's the reason why you get into a relationship and you go, oh, this isn't what I want. It's because you didn't get clearer on what you wanted to begin with. And so people do this all the time. It's not just in the relationships, because the way you do one thing is the way you do everything.
Yeah.
Right? So same with job. And that's why people jump from job to job to job. They're like, oh, you know, it's not for me. Or, oh, I figured out that this workplace environment was toxic or whatever. Yeah. So it's looking at, well, what about when things get really hard? What about when I'm feeling unsupported? What about when I'm feeling anxious, when my trauma comes up? What about in a job where I'm not making enough money? What about in a workplace environment where people aren't supporting me? And once we get super clear on those things and what you do want rather than what you don't want, then you can start to attract and call those things into your life. So clarity is really, really important.
What's stage 3?
Stage 3 is the spiritual phase. So this is where we ascend from our trauma. We start to look at our patterns and change how we communicate with our through our attachment styles. We come to a secure attachment style rather than, you know, anxious or avoidant or, you know, pushing people away.
Yeah.
It's when we can start to recognize that our partners are a mirror and direct reflection of us. Yeah. So when we look at our partner who needs change and our partner who's not doing this, what we're actually saying is there's a part of me that my partner is mirroring back to me that's flawed, that I'm yet to work on, and my ego is projecting that wound right now.
Listen back to that sentence right there. I'm just getting a time mark, 37 minutes. I like that.
So when you start to step into that level of awareness, then you're ascending to the spiritual connections and soul connections rather than trauma bonds and trauma wounds, where we just these cycles of patterns repeat themselves, and there's never resolution. It's just conflict. There's
a lot more. I'm gonna give us some extra time, by the way. It's too good to not do it. Can you just go through, what do you look for in, I agree with the honeymoon phase, pretty standard stuff, want the good looks, want the good energy, the good sex, the good money, all that good stuff. What do you look for in the other 2 phases? So what do you look for personally, just to give these ladies and gentlemen some examples to look for?
Yeah, so personally for me, one thing that I found was extremely important was when there's conflict that arises, Ryan and I like to call it disconnection.
Disconnection, that's a good word.
How do we navigate coming back to resolutions? So when there's conflict or disconnection with your partner or any of your past partners, if you're single, what happens between the moment that the conflict comes up and the time it takes you to resolve that? So we can look at the how long it takes. Do you wait a week? Do you not say anything at all and you hold on to it, and then you know, you have a list of all the things that he did, you know, last week where he didn't do the thing you asked. And so whenever there's a disconnection, I look at, well, is he communicating his needs? How is he holding space when I communicate my needs? Is he listening, or is he looking for an answer to say, but that wasn't my intention, or but I didn't make you feel that way, or that wasn't my fault, or I'm sorry if I hurt you. So we're looking at, well, how do they then navigate how you're sharing when you're having a personal experience? And here's the thing, they don't have to agree. And it probably wasn't their intention. However, you're still feeling wounded, or you're feeling triggered.
Yeah,
And it's important to look at, we're on the same team here.
Yeah.
We both want love and connection. And so when Ryan shares with me how he's feeling, if I say to him, yeah, but I didn't mean to make you feel that way, am I connecting or disconnecting from him, right? I'm disconnecting from him.
What are some of the questions for women and gentlemen to ask each other? Because this is I got onto this topic with Ryan actually. What are the questions that people can ask each other in those tough conversations, in those triggered moments, in those disconnection moments?
Here's a great question. How can I love you better?
Oof, there's a good question.
Right? Because, we all have this idea of what we think our partner needs to be loved, and sometimes we'll love people from the lens in which we want to be loved too.
Very
right?
true.
Or we love ourselves. But sometimes we forget, well, what does my partner really need right now to be loved? Because maybe there's something that I don't know that my partner really needs, and I need to create a safe space for him to share that so that he doesn't feel needy, or he doesn't silence that part of him because he feels like he's being too much, right? Or he's being weak by sharing his feelings. So when we start to ask questions like this, it creates curiosity, healthy and safe curiosity for our partners to begin to go, oh, like you care about how I want to be loved and how I feel. And one question we can begin to ask ourselves, and this is for people who are in relationships or have had past relationships where it didn't work out, where there was mistrust or loyalty. You have to ask yourself, what role did I play in this in order for my partner to withhold his truth, right? Rather than like, he's a liar, he's a cheater, he's an asshole. It's like, what part did I play in this in order for my partner to withhold his truth or to be disloyal, right? Because again, does that mean that you asked for it? No one asked to be heard. But we do attract relationships from our level of our consciousness, from our level of awareness. And that's why it's so important to start to ask questions, get really curious with ourselves and also with our partner too.
I'd love your take on this as a part of the teachings that I do, and there's just so much alignment with everything you're saying today. I'm a big Peter Crone fan, if you follow him and you follow his stuff, and it's a variation on his quote, but I truly believe that we attract people and circumstances to reveal the wounds that we haven't healed through, and you'll do that most within a relationship. That's because they're going to get to know the most authentic version of you. They're going to get to know your inner child better than anyone else, right? Because they hold that space, hopefully, if you're in a good relationship, where you feel safe enough to do it, right? But by definition of that inner child has the wounds, right? Because the ego masks the wounds. It doesn't want to show the wounds. So I guess would love to hear your thoughts on what I just said. And then also, how does one start to heal those wounds? Because if you don't heal the wound, you're just going to get triggered again from it later, and you'll attract the same relationship with a different body on it, so a different face to it. So yeah, I'd love your thoughts on that topic.
Yeah, so spot on. You are 100% correct. And there's a lot of humility that comes with realizing what Lewis has just said there, which is looking at our partners. And this is the most difficult place we can do it, because we have so much of our mother and father wounds that come up here that we want to protect ourselves from. And the humility is, I'm attracting who I am. Yeah, and that one's a really, really tough pill to swallow, because we then have to sit with our partners and their darkest parts. I don't want to say worst, because a lot of the times those darkest parts create a lot of healing, right? So the wound is where the light enters. So really it can be the most beautiful parts of ourselves, because it reveals back to us unhealed parts of ourselves, which is then the catalyst of becoming whole again. It's the catalyst of coming back to the state in which we were born with, which was whole, complete, and perfect. So a lot of the work we really want to look at here is, how do we do that? Is shadow work. So shadow work essentially is looking at our darkness. It's looking at these parts of ourselves that we can't see and we're not aware of, because our subconscious mind makes up for 95 to 97% of our brain's processing power, which is like heaps. So a lot of us are walking around in a state of autopilot, in a state of unconsciousness to these parts of ourselves. And we might say, well, I'm super aware. I've read a couple of books. It's like, yeah, of course you are. But you're becoming aware of your awareness. What you need to do is become aware of your unconsciousness, your subconscious mind. And so this is where shadow work really helps you. And having a mentor to guide you through that process is really important because it allows you to get into a surrendered state and allow someone else to guide you through that in a really safe way when maybe you are feeling triggered and you feel unsafe. So as you start to explore your shadow and these dark parts of yourself, I like to use the language of disintegrated, these parts that we push away from the psyche, we push them down. I call these parts of us exile parts. We exile them from our subconscious and our psyche to protect us. When we actually start to welcome them in and sit with these parts of us and their experience, we can seek to understand what they need in order to feel safe. When they feel safe, they surrender and they stop trying to take control, stop trying to take the light, right? So a really good example of this is if you ever known someone who's really immature and they're in their like late 20s or late 30s, you can see it's like and I don't love this language, but I'm going to say it. It's like a man-child, right? Or, Ryan talks about it as the boy, right? The men that are walking around as boys. What's actually happening there from a psychological perspective is that there's an inner child of them or a younger part of them that's like, I feel so unsafe in my world that I cannot relinquish control. I have to be in charge. I have to manipulate others to make myself feel better. I have to seek unconscious relationships in order to, gain back my sense of self-importance or validation. And so when we can start to sit with these parts of us and make peace with them, we go, what did you need back then when you were created to protect the self, to protect Nikki or protect Lewis that you didn't get? How do we allow you to feel those feelings? And generally what we needed back then was to feel loved without conditions, seen without judgment, heard without advice, and valued without expectations.
Wow.
Yeah, big. And so through parts work, which is a neuroscience model, internal family systems, parts work, which is our family of parts, has nothing to do with mum or dad. We start to recognize, wow, the part of me feels this way and a part of me feels that way. A part of me really wants to have a safe and secure love, and yet there's another part of me that can't help but to attract these unconscious relationships with men because I feel like I need to be validated by them. And so when we look at these disintegrated dark parts of us, we're like, oh my God, like she's not wanting that, but this is a pattern and a way in which she thought she needed to in order to keep herself safe from a really young age. So for me, from a personal journey in relationships, I seeked men that I could be in charge and be in my masculine, right? The alpha female. But I did that. I wanted to be in control because I felt so unsafe with the masculine. If I was surrendered, like, what if I get hurt, right? And a lot of that relates back to my relationship with my dad and also the sexual assault I experienced twice growing up. And so when I realized that and I started to recognize it, I'm safe now. I'm an intelligent, smart, powerful, conscious, embodied woman. No one's here to hurt me anymore. I was able to understand what that disintegrated part of me needed to feel safe in a relationship and surrender into my feminine and these higher, more integrated, sophisticated and mature, right? Mature parts of myself.
I can listen to you all day. You're a very, very good speaker. My last question, just to wrap this up, because we will speak for 10 hours on this podcast. What is something that you're working through right now that the world doesn't see?
I am doing a deep dive into my sexual trauma. This has been a big journey for me because through all the work that I've done, this has been the one that I've been quite scared of. And I still have a lot of forgiveness to do for myself. I still blame myself a lot for what happened when I was 12 and 14. And I know that there's a lot of trauma that I still store in my womb space. So the healing that I'm doing at the moment is it's womb healing. And I sometimes struggle to talk more about that because I still feel that I don't understand it enough yet.
Yeah.
You know, the womb healing and looking at my lower chakra centers and where that connects to my heart chakra and, you know, what's happening in my nervous system and, you know, all sorts of things, emotionally as well, because emotions get stored in the body. So there's so many things that I'm learning and developing here. And I don't think I understand it enough yet to really dive deep into sharing that experience. But that's something I'm exploring a lot with my healing that a lot of people don't know.
Beautiful. Thank you for sharing. You are a beacon of light, a vehicle for change. There's so many words that come to mind with you. What is, if so, I know we shared on the last one, but if for people that have just listened to this and they've been touched and impacted, then they want to connect with you or potentially do work with you, where can they find you?
Come find me on Instagram. It's where I put out most of my content and share most of my value. So I am on Instagram, Nikki Cassa, NIKKICASSA. And then, of course, I have my own podcast as well, Nikki Cassa Podcast. That's what it's called. And then if you are a woman listening and anything that I spoke about today touched, moved, or inspired you in any way, reach out to me on Instagram and let's have a bit of a chat about what's arising for you. Your story matters, you matter. And if it feels like an energetic fit and you feel safe enough as well, then of course I would love to have you join us in the Conscious Woman in our coaching program so that we can give you all the tools, all the answers that you are seeking right now.
Amazing. Thank you, Nikki. God bless you.
Thank you so much for having me.